Righto, let's not muck around. Fukushima is one of those events people love to reduce to a tidy little story, because tidy stories are comforting. Big wave, bad decisions, human error, move on. Beautiful, nice and useless. What we're actually looking at is a system under brutal stress. An earthquake hits, then a tsunami, then a nuclear plant goes into crisis. And that last bit matters, because by the time people start screaming for names and culprits, the system has already been tested in the harshest way imaginable. Now, from an ICAM point of view, this is exactly where investigators can either do their best work or produce a glossy bit of rubbish. If you only ask what happened, you get the visible event. Natural hazard, plant loses function, emergency response struggles, catastrophic consequences. That's the headline. And headlines are not investigations. ICAM asks a more uncomfortable question. Why did that event chain become possible? Why did the hazard get through the layers? Why were the defenses absent or failed? What task and environmental conditions shaped performance at the sharp end? And what organisational factors were lying there for years, nice and quiet, waiting to do damage? That's the split I always bang on about. What happened versus why it happened. The first gives you chronology, the second gives you prevention. And if you're in the prevention game, chronology alone is about as useful as a chocolate hard hat. Fukushima is not a simple operator error story, not even close. When an organisation faces an extreme event and multiple protections are challenged at once, blaming the people in the middle of the mess is lazy. Those people did not create the earthquake. They did not create the tsunami, and more importantly, they did not design the whole risk picture they were forced to inherit. That's why this episode matters for investigators. Major disasters expose the nonsense in blame-heavy thinking. They show us that systems fail long before the final moment. Design choices, assumptions, preparedness, communication pathways, protection measures, governance decisions. All of that is in play before a single frontline person has to make a call under pressure. So the frame for today is simple. We'll walk the event chain at the sharp end. Then we'll look at absent and failed defenses. Then task and environmental conditions. Then the organisational factors and governance issues sitting underneath it all. And by the end, if we've done this properly, we're not asking who stuffed up. We're asking, what kind of system lets a hazard turn into a catastrophe? That's the question worth your time. So let's move to the sharp end, the bit everyone can see. The plant is hit by an earthquake, then a tsunami, and the response becomes immediate, technical, pressured, messy. This is where investigators often get hypnotized by action. People did this. Someone chose that. A team responded here. Another team didn't respond fast enough there. And before you know it, the report turns into a play-by-play of stressed humans trying not to drown in a systems failure. At the visible level, the failure sequence is physical. Power is lost, systems are compromised, conditions deteriorate. Operators and emergency teams are making decisions in real time under extreme pressure. That's important data, but it's not the whole show. In ICAM language, some of those visible decisions will sit in individual or team actions. That does not mean blame, it just means actions occurred. Actions always occur. A valve is operated, or not. A shutdown sequence is attempted. A communication is made, delayed, misunderstood, or not possible. A team improvises because the normal method no longer exists. That's the sharp end. And here's the trap. Investigators love certainty after the fact. They sit in a quiet room, full lighting, coffee in hand, no radiation fear, no flooding, no screaming alarms, no half-dead batteries, and say, well, obviously they should have... Yeah? Obviously, was it? Easy to be a genius 3 months later with dry socks on. What matters is distinguishing the visible event from the deeper causal pathway. The visible event is the plant crisis unfolding. The deeper pathway is the reason the crisis became unmanageable. Those are not the same thing. If a team makes a hard call in extreme conditions, your job as investigator is not to freeze that moment and judge it like it happened in a classroom. Your job is to understand what shaped that decision and what options were genuinely available. So yes, we examine the direct actions and decisions. We absolutely should. ICAM never says ignore the sharp end. It says put the sharp end in context. Ask, what was the team facing? What information did they have? What systems were still functioning? What barriers had already collapsed? What was changing minute to minute? Because if the plant response became a desperate effort to manage a rapidly worsening physical failure sequence, then the real lesson isn't people made mistakes under pressure. No kidding. The real lesson is that by the time those people were acting, the system may already have been cornered. That's a very different finding, and a much more useful one. Now we get to the bit ICAM investigators should practically have tattooed on the inside of the eyelids: absent and failed defenses. Because hazards don't become catastrophes just because they exist. They become catastrophes when the layers meant to detect, control, protect, contain, or recover either aren't there or don't work. And in the Fukushima case, the outline is pointing us straight at the layered defense picture: seawall, sighting, backup power, flooding protection, emergency preparedness. That's not just a list of engineering topics. That's your defense map. Start with the obvious one: external protection from the tsunami. If the hazard exceeds what the site protection can cope with, that defense is failed. If the protection was never designed for the hazard that was reasonably foreseeable, then you're edging toward absent defense territory as well. Then ask about siting. Was the facility's location and exposure part of the problem? If so, that's not bad luck. That's a strategic defense issue. Then backup power. In high-hazard operations, backup power isn't a nice extra. It's part of the survival kit. If backup arrangements are vulnerable to the same event that disables the primary systems, that's not redundancy. That's two blokes in the same canoe calling themselves a rescue fleet. Flooding protection matters for the same reason. If water ingress can knock out critical systems, then separation, protection, location, sealing, or physical barriers become crucial defenses. When those are overwhelmed or ineffective, the hazard moves from external event to internal plant crisis. And then there's emergency preparedness. This is where a lot of organisations fool themselves. They've got binders, plans, diagrams, maybe a drill or two, and everyone feels quite grown up about it. But preparedness is only real if it works under degraded conditions. Can people communicate? Can they access gear? Can they make decisions when normal systems are gone? Can they recover control with minimal information and limited time? That's the key point. Defense failure turned a hazard into a catastrophe. Not the hazard by itself. The earthquake and tsunami were the initiating threats, sure. But what investigators need to map is how each layer was supposed to interrupt the sequence: awareness, detection, control and recovery, protection and containment, escape and rescue, and where those layers either had holes in them or were missing altogether. If you write that properly, your findings stop sounding like the event was unprecedented, which is often code for we'd rather not discuss our assumptions. Instead, you write something useful. Critical defenses were inadequate, vulnerable to common mode failure, or not resilient to the foreseeable loss of normal operating conditions. That's blunt, but blunt's better than useless. This chapter is where we retire, once again, the world's laziest phrase: they should have known better. Maybe, maybe not. Let's look at the conditions first, because human performance does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a place, at a time, under pressure, with constraints. The outline gives us plenty: tsunami impact, loss of power, darkness, heat, stress, communication breakdowns. That's a proper ICAM task and environmental conditions set right there. You've got a hazardous physical environment, degraded equipment performance, reduced information flow, rising uncertainty, and people trying to act inside it. Loss of power alone changes everything. It affects visibility, instrumentation, communication, access to systems, and the ability to execute normal procedures. Darkness is not just inconvenient, it narrows options. Heat is not just uncomfortable, it degrades endurance, concentration, and physical capacity. Stress is not a moral failing. It's a predictable human response when consequences are massive and time is running away from you. Then communication breakdowns. Investigators need to be careful here. When communication fails during a crisis, the temptation is to write poor communication. Stunning analysis. Thank you, Professor. The proper question is why communication became poor. Were systems degraded? Were channels overloaded? Was there no shared picture? Were teams physically separated? Was information arriving late, partial, conflicting, or not at all? And once you've got those conditions on the page, the individual and team actions start to make more sense. People under chaotic, high-threat conditions don't behave like they do on a calm Tuesday toolbox talk. Memory narrows. Attention gets dragged to the most immediate cues. Workarounds appear. Procedures may no longer fit the actual conditions. Teams rely on fragments, habit, and whatever still functions. That's why hindsight is dangerous. Hindsight irons out uncertainty. It makes the path look obvious, but at the time, it probably wasn't obvious at all. At the time, it may have been dark, hot, noisy, disrupted, and changing faster than anyone could stabilize it. Good investigators respect that. They don't excuse everything, that's not the point, but they do analyze performance in context. In safety-wise language, we're interested in the conditions that promoted errors or violations, or undermined the system's defenses, not just whether a person got something right or wrong. So for Fukushima, the lesson is clear. The environment shaped the work. The task demands shaped the decisions. Human performance was a product of the situation, not separate from it. And if your report doesn't capture that, you're not doing systems thinking. You're doing courtroom cosplay. Now for the deep end. Organisational factors and governance. This is where serious investigations either grow a spine or fold like a camp chair. Because once the evidence starts pointing beyond the front line, things get political, commercial, awkward, all the fun stuff. The outline calls it plainly. Design decisions, risk acceptance, regulatory assumptions, management culture. Good. That's where we should be looking. Organisational factors are the underlying conditions that existed before the incident and shaped the whole event field. They produce the task conditions, promote or tolerate risky practices, and undermine defences. So ask the uncomfortable questions. What did the organisation know, or what should it reasonably have known about tsunami risk? Were assumptions built into design and emergency planning that turned out to be too optimistic? Was risk being treated as a technical issue on paper rather than a real operational vulnerability? This is where codes like design, risk management, management of change, procedures, organisational learning, communication, maybe regulatory influence start waving at you. If known hazards were not translated into resilient protection, that's not just a site issue, that's governance. If assumptions about credible events were too narrow, that's governance. If warning signs existed but learning didn't travel, that's organisational learning failing in broad daylight. And don't isolate this to just the operator. In a major event like this, contractor arrangements, operator responsibilities, regulator expectations, and wider national preparedness can all matter. That doesn't mean you spray blame at everyone with a business card. It means you map the system honestly. Who designed? Who approved? Who challenged assumptions? Who monitored? Who enforced? Who learned or didn't? Management culture matters too, though investigators need to be specific. I'm always wary of reports that throw in poor safety culture because they can't be bothered writing properly. Culture is not a magic bin you chuck everything into. You need evidence. What behaviours were tolerated? What priorities were visible? Was there passive tolerance of gaps? Were efficiency, practicality, or continuity quietly allowed to outrank resilience? Same with regulatory assumptions. If a whole framework accepts a set of risk boundaries that later prove inadequate, then the finding isn't the regulator failed in some grand, dramatic sense. It's more precise than that. The regulatory and governance environment may have reinforced assumptions that constrained preparedness and allowed vulnerabilities to persist. That's the point of a governance-level investigation, not to become political theatre. to identify how decisions made far from the control room helped shape what happened in it. And once you see that, Fukushima stops being a story about stressed operators in a crisis. It becomes what major disasters nearly always are: a long, organisational story with a very violent ending. So what should investigators nick from Fukushima? Quite a lot, frankly. First lesson: don't confuse dramatic events with deep causes. The bigger the event, the more people obsess over the visible chaos. Your job is to organise the facts, build the timeline, separate contributing from non-contributing factors, and then analyse properly. Goal, as we teach it: gather, organise, analyse, learn. Not gather, panic, blame, publish. Second, map defences with discipline. If you can't clearly explain which defences were supposed to prevent the event or limit the consequences, you're not ready to write findings. For a major disaster, absent and failed defences are gold. That's where prevention lives. Third, write human performance in context. Use individual or team actions carefully and sparingly. Yes, actions matter, but task and environmental conditions often explain why those actions were likely, difficult, improvised, delayed, or flawed. If you write the people up as the cause without the conditions, you've missed the point and probably taught the organisation nothing. Fourth, go after organisational factors with evidence and courage. Procedures, risk management, design, management of change, organisational learning, communication, regulatory influence if the evidence supports it. Don't water it down into lessons to be mindful of. Lovely phrase that. Means absolutely bugger all. Fifth, recommendations should change the system, not decorate it. Safety-wise bangs on about smarter recommendations and the hierarchy of controls for a reason. If your answer to a systemic disaster is retrain staff and remind people to follow procedure, you have learned nothing. Strong investigations should drive changes to design, resilience, protection, emergency capability, governance, and verification. Harder controls where possible, better defences, better planning, better monitoring. And sixth, maybe the biggest one, accountability is not scapegoating. A proper investigation can hold the system accountable. In fact, that's the whole point. Accountability without blame means naming deficient controls, poor assumptions, weak governance, missing learning, and inadequate preparedness. Then making sure somebody with authority owns the fix. That's what strong investigation should change: design, learning, and accountability. Not just the report cover, not just the wording, not just another poster in the lunchroom saying safety is our priority until the next budget meeting. Fukushima, looked at through ICAM, is a reminder that disasters are rarely born in a single moment. They're assembled over time, piece by piece, assumption by assumption, defense by defense. And if investigators are brave enough to see that clearly, then maybe the next report actually does something useful. We'll leave it there for now. And yeah, there's plenty more where that came from.